While most gamers were busy with Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, PC players had their own world of strange, ambitious, and sometimes groundbreaking role-playing games. These weren't the flashy blockbusters with massive ad campaigns. They were the experiments, the cult classics, and the titles that dare to be different. Today, we're diving into those forgotten PC-exclusive RPG gems. Released in 2001, Anachronox is one of those games that critics praised but almost nobody played. Built on the Quake 2 engine, it wasn't the flashiest RPG on the market, but what it lacked in polish, it more than made up for with wit, personality, and ambition. Think of it as a mix between classic Final Fantasy storytelling and a quirky sci-fi detective comedy, and you'll start to see why it has such a cult following. You play as a washed-up private detective stumbling his way through a galaxy of bizarre planets, eccentric aliens, and ridiculous situations. The writing is where the game shines. It's genuinely funny, filled with clever dialogue, self-aware humor, and moments that still hold up decades later. The party you assemble includes everything from a brilliant scientist to, hilariously, a literal planet that joins your team as a character. It's the kind of wild creativity you rarely see in big-budget RPGs today. Combat borrowed from JRPGs with turn-based battles, but added its own twists, including interactive elements and unique character skills. While not groundbreaking, it was solid enough to keep the story moving. What really set the game apart was its cinematic presentation. Developer Ion Storm used in-engine cutscenes that felt ambitious for the time, giving the story a film-like pacing that few RPGs could match. The problem was that launched with almost no marketing, overshadowed by bigger releases of its era, and the devs was already sinking under bad press for Daikatana. As a result, sales tanked, and a planned sequel was scrapped despite the original ending on a massive cliffhanger. Even so, those who played it swear by its charm. It's flawed, yes, buggy at times and rough around the edges, but Anachronox stands as proof that a game doesn't need blockbuster graphics to deliver unforgettable characters and storytelling. It's the definition of a hidden gem, and one that deserves far more recognition than it ever got. Dungeon Siege arrived in 2002 as Microsoft's answer to Diablo. It was a PC-exclusive RPG that combined hack-and-slash action with the scope of an epic adventure. At first glance, it looked like another dungeon crawler, but it had a unique hook, seamless exploration. Unlike most RPGs where loading screens broke immersion, Dungeon Siege allowed you to travel across massive landscapes without a single interruption. For players at the time, it felt revolutionary, an unbroken journey through forests, caves, swamps, and ruined castles, with enemies swarming from every direction. The game also introduced an evolving class system that felt surprisingly modern. Instead of locking into a rigid role, your character's abilities grew based on what you actually did. Swing a sword long enough, and you became a master fighter. Focus on spells, and you'd evolve into a powerful mage. This flexibility gave players a sense of freedom and encouraged experimentation. Combined with party-based mechanics and fast-paced combat, it became a critical and commercial hit, proving that PC-exclusive RPGs could compete with juggernauts. Its success led to Dungeon Siege 2, which expanded the formula with more depth, choices, and story content, solidifying the series as a fan favorite. But despite strong beginnings, the franchise never quite broke into the mainstream conversation. By the time Dungeon Siege 3 arrived years later, on consoles as well as PC, the series had lost its identity, drifting toward a generic action RPG style that left longtime fans disappointed. Still, the original games remain a nostalgic touchstone for PC gamers who remember their bold design, technical innovations, and sheer ambition. They stand as proof that the PC could deliver massive, cinematic RPG experiences on its own terms. By the late 90s, the Rift War fantasy novels had already been adapted into games, with Betrayal at Krondor earning legendary status among PC RPG fans. Its follow-up, Return to Krondor, should have been a triumphant continuation. Instead, it became one of the most overlooked RPGs of its era. The game aimed to bring the novel's richly detailed world to life once again, but this time with a more cinematic, chapter-based structure. Players stepped into the roles of multiple characters across a sprawling story of political intrigue, magic, and betrayal in the Kingdom of the Isles. On paper, it had everything going for it: strong writing, deep lore from the books, and a chance to expand on the beloved foundation of Betrayal at Krondor. But the sequel faced a tough battle. The late 90s were crowded with flashy new RPGs, and its more rigid, linear structure frustrated fans who had loved the freedom of the original. Technical issues and a lack of polish didn't help its reputation either. Despite these flaws, the game still offered an engaging narrative filled with memorable moments, branching decisions, and a faithful adaptation. For fans of the books, it was a chance to experience familiar characters and settings in a new way, even if it never reached the same heights as its predecessor. Over time, Return to Krondor faded into obscurity, overshadowed by the explosive rise of RPG heavyweights like Baldur's Gate and Planescape Torment. Yet for those who played it, the game remains a fascinating artifact of PC RPG history, a reminder of how literary storytelling and gaming could merge, even if the execution wasn't perfect. By the time Wizardry 8 released in 2001, the RPG landscape had changed dramatically. The franchise had been around since 1981, practically defining what PC RPGs looked like in their earliest days. But while the series was hugely influential, it had become increasingly niche, with more cinematic RPGs like Baldur's Gate and Final Fantasy dominating the spotlight. It ended up being both the swan song of the series and one of its most ambitious entries. At its core, it's a first-person, party-based RPG that mixes old-school dungeon crawling with modern touches. You don't just control one hero. You build an entire party from scratch, choosing races, classes, and skills, and then watch as they grow through brutal turn-based battles. The amount of customization was staggering, and the game demanded real planning. Every choice mattered, from how you developed your team to how you approached encounters. What made it stand out, though, was its world. Instead of a straightforward dungeon dive, it gave players an open environment filled with factions, branching quests, and multiple possible endings. The voice acting was surprisingly solid, with plenty of humor and personality that gave life to your ragtag crew. For fans of deep, tactical combat and character building, this was paradise. But accessibility was its biggest hurdle. The game was dense, often unforgiving, and visually outdated compared to its peers. Where Morrowind was dazzling players with open worlds, Wizardry 8 looked and felt like an artifact from an earlier era. That disconnect limited its mainstream appeal, even though those who gave it a chance often discovered one of the richest RPG experiences of the time. Today, it's remembered fondly as both the end of an era and a reminder of what PC RPGs were like before they became streamlined. It's not an easy game to jump into, but for players willing to wrestle with its complexity, it delivers an experience that few modern titles can replicate. Released in 1992, Darklands is one of those RPGs that feels almost mythical now. It didn't sell well, it was buggy at launch, and most players moved on, but the ideas it introduced were decades ahead of its time. Rather than sending you into a fantasy land with elves and dragons, it dropped you into a gritty version of medieval Germany, where history and folklore blended together in a way that felt shockingly authentic. Instead of casting fireballs because your character had magic points, you relied on alchemy, saintly blessings, and period-accurate weapons. It wasn't high fantasy. It was dark, strange, and deeply rooted in real culture. You didn't play a chosen hero, but a party of ordinary people, each with their own background and skill set. The freedom was incredible for the era. You could travel across Germany, take on contracts, fight bandits, or even clash with Inquisition forces. The game didn't follow a traditional linear story. It was open-ended, letting you carve out your own path in a living world. Encounters felt almost like a tabletop RPG session, complete with text-driven choices that often carried real consequences. Of course, all this ambition came at a cost. The game was notoriously buggy at launch, to the point where many players couldn't finish it without patch discs mailed directly from the devs. The graphics, even at the time, were considered rough, and the learning curve was brutal. A lot of players bounced off it quickly, which explains why it never became a household name. But for those who stuck with it, Darklands was unforgettable. It showed that RPGs didn't have to be confined to Tolkien-inspired fantasy worlds. That history itself could be just as rich and terrifying. Today, it's remembered as a cult classic, one that paved the way for the idea of historically grounded RPGs. King of Dragon Pass is a game that defies simple classification. Released in 1999, it wasn't a typical RPG or a straightforward strategy game. Instead, it blended elements of both into a truly unique experience. The game is set in Glorantha, a deep, lore-rich fantasy world, and puts you in charge of a clan of settlers trying to survive and thrive in a hostile land. It focuses on resource management and narrative-driven decision-making rather than combat, making it a hybrid experience that was ahead of its time. The game's magic comes from its storytelling. Each year presents new events like raids, omens, or political disputes, each with multiple options for how to respond. You might choose to negotiate, fight, appease the gods, or take a risk. Every choice has consequences that ripple through the decades, shaping your clan's fate and reputation among rival tribes. Unlike many games of its era, it didn't hold your hand. You had to balance resources like food and cattle while managing your people's morale and loyalty. Religious rituals, hero quests, and divine favor were as important as military strength. The game was about building a living culture, not just winning battles. This uniqueness, however, also worked against it. The game baffled many players at its release, as they didn't know how to approach such a text-heavy, slow-paced experience. It wasn't flashy and demanded patience and a willingness to invest in its complex systems. As a result, it never gained mainstream traction and faded into obscurity. In hindsight, its influence is clear. Modern narrative-driven strategy games like Crusader Kings and Pendragon owe a debt to the template king of Dragon Pass created. Today, the game has a second life thanks to re-releases on PC and mobile, where its blend of myth, management, and storytelling has earned it a cult following. While it may not be the easiest game to dive into, it offers an experience unlike anything else for those willing to learn its rhythms. If you've ever wanted an RPG that lets you play not just as a hero or villain, but as a creator of life itself, Geneforge is the series that dared to go there. The first game dropped in 2001, and over the years it spun out into a full 5-part saga. It never had the flashy production values of mainstream RPGs. No big-name voice actors, no high-end visuals, but what it did have was choice. And not the illusion of choice, but real, branching paths that made every playthrough feel different. The setup is simple but powerful. You're part of a secretive order called the Shapers, who can craft living beings out of raw essence. These creations can be loyal servants, monstrous weapons, or something in between, depending on how you guide them. From the moment you set foot in the world, the game asks you tough questions. Do you follow the rigid laws of the Shapers, or do you rebel against them and side with the creations themselves? This moral tug-of-war is the heart of the game. Each faction has its own goals, philosophies, and consequences, and unlike many RPGs, there's no single right choice. Aligning with one group often alienates the others, meaning you're constantly weighing your power against your ethics. It's one of those rare games where role-playing doesn't just mean picking dialogue options. It means shaping the entire world through your decisions. Of course, the series wasn't perfect. The graphics were bare bones, even by early 2000 standards, with simple isometric maps and clunky UI. Combat could feel repetitive, and the difficulty spikes were infamous. Years later, the series has started to get a second life, with Geneforge 1 receiving a remastered edition in 2021 that modernized the visuals and mechanics while keeping its soul intact. It's a reminder that you don't need a billion-dollar budget to tell a gripping, choice-driven story. You just need creativity and the courage to let players decide what kind of world they want to live in. If you were around the CRPG scene in the early 2000s, chances are you stumbled across a Spiderweb software title. This studio became a cult favorite for players who cared more about storytelling and depth than flashy visuals. Avernum is probably the best example of that philosophy. Originally born as a remake of the Exile series, it grew into a full saga that spanned multiple releases, each one expanding the scope of its underground fantasy world. The premise is brilliantly simple but endlessly compelling. The Empire exiles criminals, rebels, and unwanted citizens into a vast subterranean world known as Avernum. Instead of dying off, the people thrown down there build their own society, waging a constant struggle for survival against monsters, starvation, and the shadow of the Empire above. It's not just a dungeon crawl. It's about carving out life in a hostile, alien world that feels as much like a character as any NPC. What made it stand out was its openness. You weren't forced down a single path. You could ally with factions, wander freely, and solve problems in multiple ways. The games encouraged experimentation and rewarded creativity, giving you a sense of true freedom at a time when many RPGs still relied on rigid structures. Combined with solid tactical combat and a surprisingly dark narrative, it felt like you were living in a world that reacted to your choices. But it was never mainstream. The visuals were primitive, even by indie standards, with tile-based maps and stiff sprites. Combat could drag at times, and the sheer length of the series demanded patience. Critics often brushed it off as niche curiosities while bigger budget RPGs grabbed attention. Yet the series endured, remade, and refined multiple times across the years. That persistence kept its world alive and slowly built a devoted fan base that still swears by it today. By 2011, Spiderweb Software had already established itself as the underdog of PC RPGs, and with Avedon the Black Fortress was something different. Where Avernum was sprawling, open-ended, and sometimes messy, Avedon took a more focused approach. Tight storytelling, structured missions, and a clearer sense of direction. In many ways, it felt like an indie Baldur's Gate or Dragon Age Origins, but filtered through a minimalist style. The premise puts you in the shoes of a Hand of Avedon, essentially an agent of a powerful organization tasked with protecting a fragile alliance of nations. On paper, you're one of the good guys, maintaining peace and order, but the game constantly asks you to question what that actually means. Avedon itself is feared and resented, and as you carry out missions, you're forced into morally gray choices. Do you enforce the law without mercy? Or do you side with those who see Avedon as oppressive? That tension between duty and conscience drives much of the narrative, making it far more thought-provoking than its unassuming visuals suggest. Unlike Avernum, which leaned heavily on open exploration, it had a more streamlined design. Missions sink you into carefully crafted areas filled with combat, dialogue, and decisions that shaped how people saw you. The party system added depth, with companions who had their own stories and perspectives. It was smaller in scale compared to AAA RPGs of the time, but it delivered a surprising amount of character and weight in its storytelling. Of course, its biggest drawback was its presentation. Even then, the graphics felt dated with isometric sprites and environments that looked closer to a late 90s title. Combat could also feel repetitive if you weren't already invested in turn-based tactics. For many players, these surface-level flaws kept it from ever reaching mainstream attention. But for those who gave it a chance, Avedon revealed itself as one of the most mature and tightly written RPGs of its era.